Welcome back to another conversation with Rita van der Schuyf. In the first episodes, we talked about what radical town transformation is. In this episode, we're going to focus a bit more on the key players. So, Rita, welcome back.
Thank you, Jaco. It's great to be back.
When does it become absolutely necessary for town transformation? And do you think you can, shape the future of a town? Is that the correct way to put it?
Yes, I would kind of think, you'd hope that somebody like me would believe in the future of towns. Otherwise, I would not be doing what I'm doing. But the kind of notion that you ask is, when does it become necessary to transform a town? I think that's a little bit more textured, nuanced in terms of determining when is that point. And the way that I'd like to answer that question is, it becomes necessary when a town or a place gets to a point where it starts collapsing, what we call a collapse. So there is this notion of there's perhaps not a lot of economic viability left in the place, or perhaps there's social degradation that you have to kind of question, what is the future of this place if we don't intersect? If that means that it leads to a place where almost kind of feral or lawlessness takes place, then I think to avoid a political liability or to avoid a social liability, it becomes an absolute necessity to actually transform that place.
Outside of Oranje, Mund and so on, you've had a look at the other towns in Namibia. I would say, would you propose that there are things to be done in certain towns?
Absolutely. I think if I just perhaps look at from a regional perspective, go bottom up, I do think Rospina is soon going to be at that point. The life of mines are maturing. The two mines, in fact, one is already in care and maintenance.
You already mentioned the previous episode that it's a private town.
It's still a private town, but it's an open town.
Yes,
so that's a little bit of a distinction around. So yes, that's a definite given. And then I would see for sure would be the case of Lüderitz. Of course, that's kind of a given. But I think Tsumeb is also at risk at the moment. I think the smelter is recently transferred to the Chinese. I think it's quite a strongly positioned town in the country, but I kind of think those were the very obvious ones.
Okay.
And I do think then strong development into Walvis Bay and infrastructure around, just because of the economic potential it's creating for the country from a port perspective. I think that's where a lot of investment can and should go.
How does the decision come about?
The decision to transform a town really depends on what the impetus for that transformation is. So for a moment, if I can go back to some of our discussions in that first episode, if the impetus, for example, is a national disaster, environmental disaster, then you can understand that the decisions come from the national government. If the impetus is to bring about a very different economic outcome, so either to perhaps redirect a collapsing town from an economic perspective or to stimulate economic growth perspective, then the decisions might actually probably come more from the private sector alongside the public sector. It's very seldom that I find that the decisions to transform a town comes from civil society. There are some examples where perhaps the communities come together in small towns in South Africa. In fact, I think Tolbach or Rebecca Steele, these very small towns, the community came together and actually agreed to do certain actions to upgrade the face of the town, to perhaps plant all certain facades outside to kind of bring some kind of cohesion, to actually bring about a different trajectory. But more often than not, it is your government that makes a decision for a geopolitical reason, for economic development reason or social reason, and or increasingly the private sector, especially where they might have a liability to do so.
Okay, so you mentioned now a case specifically where the townspeople decided to give it a bit of a facelift.
Correct.
But that isn't necessarily the bigger transformative thing.
It's definitely not the transformation. Of course, they don't have the means, they don't have the positional power to do that. They don't have the skill set. They of course don't have the resources to do that. So they might kind of create pressure groups that would pressure on government to kind of do lobbying. That will perhaps awaken government and put pressure on government to prioritize it more so than what they otherwise would. But yes, the ultimate decision makers would be a government and or in partnership with private sector.
So there are many aspects to this decision, like the political environment, economical environment. How does this inform town transformation?
It plays a huge role. So when one comes to a town transformation environment, you begin to kind of first assess, of course, what is the political structure? So how does governance work? How does government decision-making processes work? So it's really important to understand that. I think a lot would also center around what is the political agenda at a particular moment in time, and is it in line or conducive towards the particular development that needs to take place. So that political context play a big role. I think currently in the context of Namibia at least, also, how many parties are in government at any particular point in time also influence the pace of decision-making or the homogenous nature of your decision-making. So I think that's kind of how political contexts play a role. I think economic contexts also play a role because, depending on the state of wealth in the country, to what extent can they afford these transformations, or what is the economic opportunity, or what economic opportunities can you leverage to actually help stimulate it plays a big consideration how you go about that. And then finally, your social conditions play a big role because to what extent are people open to change? How easily do they adapt to change? How poor is the country? What is the Gini coefficient in terms of the state of poverty and or education in that place? And therefore, what do you have to work with to be able to actually transform that state? So I think those factors play a huge role in the ease. And not always in the technical capability, because I think more often than not, it's always technically possible.
Yes.
But are there other factors that make it complicated? How much do they contribute to the ease of actually leading to that transformation? So a huge role.
And I think you also say that this is not a quick fix thing. This is a long-term thing.
Absolutely. And also alongside that long-term, it be especially in developing countries that probably one could argue, although it's not entirely true, have a higher predisposition to needing these transformations, but they don't always have the funding to do that. So how do you kind of make these two dichotomies meet to actually lead to the outcome that you would ideally want?
So, and then also, what are the priorities of governments when it comes to developing towns?
That, again, would depend on what is the particular appetite or the particular economic or geopolitical policy of that government at any point in time. So on the one hand, what could be a priority is that if they want to reposition the country geopolitically in a very different way. So the fantastic example that I could use there is Singapore, where it was part of Malaysia. Now it kind of singled itself off to become a country in its own right. And then how to actually geopolitically actually create a position for it on the international or global stage. That was very much a priority based on geopolitical considerations. If you perhaps now look a little bit more on economic development, and here we can actually draw on the cases more close to home, is where in the case of Lüderitz, you've got from a national perspective and or regional perspective a huge economic drive that then becomes the priority, is we want to do it because we want to increase GDP potential for the country and all sorts of economic development and social development that come from that. The slightly more uncomfortable truth, at least from my perspective, that I want to bring through your question is a lot of people put to the forefront that it is a priority to bring across social transformation. So basically solve for social inequality or, solve for social injustices of the past. Then it becomes a little bit complicated. I'm not saying that some of those disappointing realities or tough realities should not be addressed, but it per se can't be the priority in that decision-making, because if that becomes the priority, you're kind of misaligning the kind of critical notion that it's only through economic enablement, yet all sorts of different levels of economic strata, that brings about the mechanisms that brings greater social well-being. So the social persuasion is sometimes the one that I think is presented as a priority, but is in fact not necessarily the way in which one should approach these town transformations, albeit that it's a very important goal. So I want to very much qualify that it's an important outcome, but it's not the prioritized reason for doing it.
But I mean, there's always a political hook to everything you have to consider.
Of course, one can't deny that. But as long as one understands that some of that has to be for, perhaps appeasing voters or for particular strongholds in the political structure. But as long as that doesn't overshadow the overarching necessity to create economic sustainability. Because if you don't do so, that at least in my opinion, in the longer term, actually recreate a social dependency.
Yes.
And you actually kind of never quite fulfill the promise. And that is a disappointing outcome. And that misdirects, voters, which basically leads to mistrust and disappointment. And lack of confidence in leadership.
I think we mentioned in a few times in the previous episode this kind of avoiding the need for dependency, creating something more sustainable.
Correct. I mean, that's sometimes tough,
it is,
right? Because one has this notion from an empathetic perspective or a sense of appreciation, just how difficult some people's real life situations could be. But unfortunately, philanthropy at some stage need to help. If people are so destitute, of course, you need to kind of provide that there's some means through which these people can survive. But the real way that you help them is to create and enable opportunities for employment, even extremely small and humble versions of that. But it's to get to them to a place where they can sustain their own life and have a sense of pride, and a sense of purpose in that, as opposed to a state of dependency, and almost kind of create almost a reliance and a victimhood relationship with their public sector.
I love the aspect or the idea of purpose.
Absolutely. I think we all need that. Absolutely. And reinstall a sense of self-respect, I think, and self-worth through that.
And how do governments usually react to opportunities of transformation?
I would like to say, on the face of it, always typically possible. But I want to qualify that, again, it depends on what the original impetus was.
Yes.
So they react, of course, increasingly positive if it is a situation where there's geopolitical gain in the process, of course. There's also a very positive response. It would ultimately lead to economic growth. And of course, they will also respond well if through those mechanisms there's address of avoiding social decline and ultimately achieving social upliftment. I think where the government sometimes struggle, and understandably so, is when that requires funding from them.
Yes, no, of course.
And then it puts them in a slightly tougher response cycle, because then they have to start prioritizing, well, how does this opportunity weigh up versus other priorities that I have elsewhere in the country that one could argue has equally good reasons. And then it becomes, well, depending on who pays for it, but of course, everybody will always open to the potential of creating or unlocking potential. It's just ultimately in practice who pays or what is required from me to get that gain.
Yes,
that's where governance might be a little bit more reflective, or from my perspective, sometimes, not meaning to be critical, but slower in the response cycles that what I could foresee. But part of it also, I think there is a somewhat kind of tied to the notion that they don't necessarily have the experience to understand what this means, and that might not actually require that much from them if they, again, just unlock a few key decisions, what could actually be done for them and with them in their interest. And that's kind of where hopefully somebody like me, but not only me, can play a role to demystify that and to bring clarity to that, so they actually know what is at stake for them, and what the opportunity costs might be, but also what it might require from them, and that it's perhaps not as costly from a variety of perspectives that they might first assume.
And that's, for me, it's the interesting thing with the cost of things. For instance, sometimes it must be difficult to quantify what it's really going to cost to transform a town. And I think that's why, especially, can probably say in the African context, that foreign investment plays a big role.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It does, but you know what, Jaco, there's a part of it, and that it's not so easy to perhaps explain this component, but I kind of think, especially from a government perspective, the critical thing that they can do that is not always so costly is the concept of enablement. So kind of clarity around what terms businesses can begin or not begin, to what extent there's licenses that reached out, clarity in terms of how economic policy will be developed. It's actually the pace of decision-making and or allowing environments in which, economic development can easily happen. And that's very seldom sitting around policy-making, decision-making, and not actually funding. Because if there's such good opportunities, the private sector will bring their funding.
That's very true. I
think it's the mindset that the government think that they need to pay for the economic stimulus. And I think that is not always the case.
Yes.
And I think therefore there sits opportunity to reshift biases.
I think in there lies the other questions, like how inclined and open government is to engage with the private sector actively on this. I think that's something that is a clash. It depends on your region and so on.
Absolutely. I think historically there was very, one could argue globally there was kind of this private sector role is, of course, going to do economic development, and public sector needs to create this enabling role, and it's very clearly divorced. I think in Namibia there's perhaps a blur of those lines. I know we're not only talking about Namibia, but seeing that we're currently in Namibia, we can perhaps say that there's opportunity for those boundaries and role clarification for economic development to be drawn and kind of say, is there opportunities to redefine that? But that being said, I am seeing in part out of necessity, but also out of progressive thinking, that the public sector and the private sector are beginning to understand that actually, if we begin to collaborate, it's a bumpy start. We need to learn how to still do this well.
But it's a start.
We can actually, if we co-join our resources and our efforts, do a lot more if we actually look to collaborate on very clear lines of accountability, but also on ways to how do we actually marry our roles. Because societies are growing too fast for governments alone to solve problems on economic and social levels. So they will need the private sector and vice versa.
Yes,
right?
No,
It's an interdependency, but competition there is, I think, our future.
Do you think governments do enough forward planning for transformations?
I am afraid that I have to answer as a futurist and somebody that is used to really forward planning. I have to say that the answer to that is no. But I want to very quickly qualify of why I'm saying no is that I do think governments have become a lot better to do an element of forward planning. So they are definitely potentially planning for 5-10 years ahead. I think for the world we're living in now, we need to actually think about mega cycle forward planning. And I don't think governments are there yet. So here I'm talking about more the 15, the 20, and even the 30 or even the 50-year planning. Because I think if we kind of cast occasionally, I'm not saying every day, that forward lens of planning, it might give us very different perspectives if you backcast around what you might need to do and what you might foresee. So I think, yes, governments have got better to perhaps at least intentionally beginning to plan beyond their political cycles, but the structure of their political setup or governance setups is still such that governments are quite often, more often than not, tied to shorter cycles than we'd like to think. And the same is not too different for the private sector, right? They also have annual financial statements and results articulation.
Yes.
So our systems have not yet caught up with the increasing need for much longer term future planning. And again, I'm not saying that that should be at the cost of short-term, real-time problems today, but if I was to use business language, is to find that happy medium between what is urgent and important, but the moment we kind of focusing only on what is urgent and not really important long-term investments on mega cycles. And I think there's room for opportunity on that for sure.
To have someone like you in a government position as well, I think is a very necessary element, because I keep thinking every new president that steps in actually inherits,
of course,
all the things.
Yes, for good or for bad. Yes, absolutely.
And yeah, it's that typical thing of 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Correct. And we've all been, and again, it's not just the public sector and the private sector, and especially in the investment banking field, there might have been for a particular functional leader or business leader, a particular flavor at a particular point in time, and then very focused on that. And then kind of, if he or she leaves that position, then the company shifts key, and all that investment that was directed towards that, and quite often for very good reasons, then get misdirected and diluted. So it's also actually making sure that the investments you're committed to are actually come to fruition.
Yes.
You see it through. I mean, of course, I'm not saying that you should continue investing in projects that was ill-founded or that the reason for it has been changed. So I'm not excluding pragmatism and reality on the day-to-day basis. But I think we've overleaned to that short-term decision-making everywhere, as opposed to kind of beginning to think also longer-term alongside short-term decision-making.
I know you spoke about Ukraine in the first episode.
Yes.
That as terrible as the situation is currently there, it does offer an opportunity to apply
absolutely
this forward way of thinking.
Correct.
How is it going to be reestablished?
Absolutely. I love that you're already spotting that opportunity, because, yes, of course, Ukraine can ill afford now to kind of spend its time on forward planning. It's got so much that it needs to day-to-day real-time focus on. But, yes, if experts could already be drawn as a little bit of a pre-vision, or what they kind of call precursor strategy work, could already begin to actually form frameworks now, so that time is not lost when it actually comes to the phase of recovery and some investment has been done. Even if it's people on an international level that can't directly or geopolitically afford to get their hands obviously dirty on the front line, could already actually aid the country by beginning to do some of that work as part of their contribution to rebuilding that very important place.
Yeah, whether it's planning or funding.
Correct. And again, to wait for they're ready, but to actually put the foundations in place. Yeah, that would be serious forward planning.
And that's
so well spotted.
That's a good example of what you also mentioned. This is a different scenario, but like when it's ready.
Yes, when it's ready.
Regarding the Gini coefficient element in Namibia, we're not performing that well. So would you like to touch on that a bit?
Yes, I would, because I think, although we have in earlier conversations said, or qualified that, social restitution and, addressing the great poor is not necessarily the key focus of a town transformation project. But I want to very quickly add to that through these transformation projects where you are definitely looking to create a lot of economic livelihood, through that process, there's real opportunity to actually look at how you can improve the well-being and therefore directly or indirectly the Gini coefficient of a country, but also the Gini coefficient of a place. So yes, I think through that there's huge opportunity to reposition a country or a place on that scale to make sure that there's less inequalities. But again, I want to haste to add, it can't be the entire motivation because it might misdirect your strategic focus, and to do it in the right way so that people actually can long-term be lifted out of their current state of poverty or inequality. So inequality is an important thing to rectify, for sure, but it can't be your core reason. But Gini coefficient can definitely, through these processes, be a positive outcome.
Yeah, because the main thing is, I think it's also what we kind of mentioned now earlier, is if that becomes the priority to not enable self-sufficiency, you're going to be kind of bogged down by keeping that aspect of the
Correct.
going.
And you might overlook opportunities that was perhaps been a slower pace of allowing people to readdress that, but it would have been more sustainable in the long term. And you might be a little bit more short-term or tactical or, just have the wrong biases and the lenses are then skewed.
Rita, have you seen the impact of improved inequality, both in Namibia and internationally?
I would like to answer the question to say, yes, of course, we've seen it, but these types of measures quite often is subjective because, what is inequality and how do you go about measuring it? I think we're not yet in stages of maturity where it's easy to measure these softer components of our societal structures. So the way that I kind of perhaps would like to answer is perhaps through illustration of a couple of cases. So if we go to the case of Oraniemund, what we did see is, for example, and the same is true for a case that I worked on in Karabip in Namibia, where you actually kind of allowed people to, or facilitated processes where home ownership in this generation becomes the first instance where they truly own homes in the way that, more Western societies are well familiar with. And that home ownership brings a whole different dynamic of well-being and creating assets that becomes transferable across generations. So it's not immediate, yes, that you can say, well, yes, here's immediately readdressed from somebody from left to right. But through a mechanism, you've unlocked potential that brings a very different potential and outlook to families and or communities. So that would be perhaps one example through the notion of home ownership. But if we can also draw to the case of Oraniemund, where, as we spoke quite a lot about the unintentional dependency that was created, now through the process of transformation, their mindset shift, that they become entrepreneurs.
Yes.
Their kind of sense of potential shifts of what is possible for them. And one does unlock that, which then kind of leads to the notion of unlocking different trajectories where almost the economic ownership becomes into their own hands as opposed to dependency always on a government or public sector or a large corporate to provide. And you begin to shift that outlook of what is possible for them at their different states of economic or socioeconomic status.
And the interesting thing is, and we talked about this in length in the previous episode, is that it is long-term.
Absolutely. It's a long-term process. So your economic measures or your commercial endeavors in that might show evidence sooner, or your technical build out of houses or roads or infrastructure, that might be evident quite soon. But of course, the social and human elements will show up much later.
Yes.
And therefore, you have to have a very clear focus on it and invest in it, but your measures will be indirect and will come years later even. I'm not saying only, but that's more likely to be the case.
So you did speak about the private sector a bit in a lot of the previous episode, but what is the actual role?
That role, again, I keep on coming back to that notion, really depends on what led to the decision to transform the town and who were the role players. So very much the legacy or history of that place. So the private sector could actually have one of two roles, and one more prominent than the other, is in instances where a private sector, on the one hand, has either previously created unintentionally a liability or dependency, I should rather say. Then they, of course, now have this, one could argue, obligation to play a very strong role to either enable that environment through skill sets, through resourcing, but they need to kind of take quite a strong role in how does one now change this trajectory. Similar examples where the private sector could take a very strong role in that process is where they perhaps have an investment interest in that area. So it's a new investment interest. Again, there you'd argue that they have quite a strong, I think, impetus or perhaps a strong persuasion to play a very strong role in the creation of that ecosystem in which they want to invest. The other examples where it could be perhaps more government-led transformation initiative, in that case, and here I'm going to refer to the examples like a Singapore, like a Dubai, or even like the line that's now kind of making such
that's
yeah.
How many kilometers or miles?
It's tens of.
It's
I actually kind of still meant to look that up, but actually neglected to do so. But yes, it's almost kind of mind-boggling. But in those cases, although it's government-led, it is critical to actually co-opt the private sector because, of course, institutions form a very important fabric of your societies because they lead groups of people. They provide economic potential for people through the jobs that they offer. So in those cases, albeit that they're perhaps not direct decision makers, they do play a very strong role to actually work with the government to actually bring about, as part of the vision that the government sets, the ways in which the government could express their ideal outcomes in terms of the role they want the private sector to play in terms of the economic potential, the employment potential, the leadership potential, in what the fibre of that country is. Almost like looking like a quilt, which of the quilts are folded by the private sector to actually form the texture of that landscape. And in that sense, they play a secondary role, but a critical economic development role still.
Would you also say that's the what's the correct word? People who do the actual execution.
They sit on the front end of execution, but they're not perhaps then critically the one that sets the strategy.
Yes.
In the prior examples that I've mentioned, there's a strong notion that they set the strategy. So if I can, for a moment also go back to where a private sector might take more of a leading edge. We've definitely looked at the cases of Oranje.
Yes.
The Ludwig's case is more of a hybrid between the government and the private sector. But I could also draw on a case of that's more of a regional development, district in a city is King's Cross development.
King's Cross development.
So King's Cross is, let's say, a borough in London. So I was going to say it's a suburb of London for lack of a better description. And in that case, there was actually property developers that understood that this is an underdeveloped part of the city of London, and actually from that perspective approached the Mayor of London. So there again, private sector development that could unlock then with public sector participation an enormous strategy. Is probably one of the biggest success stories that I've recently come across.
That's fantastic.
Where they've created what was a derelict area and actually transformed it in a multi-purpose hub where there's now a transportation hub. So it's become a central train station in and across England, but also into Europe through the Eurostar departing from that space, but also a lot of retail offerings, a lot of recreation offerings, residential living, commercial operations into one area that's been very well thought out. But again, stimulated by the private sector that initiated it as an offering into the public sector, which then collaborated well to actually achieve that really extraordinary outcome.
That's fantastic. And do you think this is something, this is maybe a bit off topic, but do you think this is something that will happen a bit more in your larger cities? Because
absolutely,
a lot of things will change. I read a lot about population decline or negative birth rate, and so there will be a lot of things changing. So that's probably something that also needs to be taken into consideration.
Very much so. And and perhaps some of our future discussions, I would love us to do a deep dive on that very important point that you raise. But yes, I agree. And even we bring it a little bit closer to home. So let's say in the case of Ludwig's, where in our previous episode we discussed about the notion that it's at the moment arguably a government responsibility to lead the transformation of the town. I think what in reality is going to happen is that it can be a little bit more of a collaboration between the private sector and the public sector that will actually unlock that potential. That would be the right way to do it because it's just too expensive, too big to do it independently from one of the constituents. But there, I think the private sector is already playing a strong role and will play a formal role in the process of transforming that town. But yes, as world populations become an issue, I think there's going to be a stronger play in that.
You spoke at length about Oranjemund already, and you established 2 companies. What are these companies? What roles do they play?
Yes, I mean, in the case of Oranjemund, we did create 2 companies, and again, kind of coming to this notion that you want to create vehicles that can actually support the development or town transformation programs. And I'm not recommending that that's always going to be the case in all cases, but it was quite necessary in the case of Oranjemund. And one of the companies is called MD 2030, which is a company that was created to actually create a platform on which all of the stakeholders we've mentioned, so your public sector, your private sector and civil society, could actually co-join their efforts to collaborate on what should the strategy for the town be. So it was a vehicle created for strategy alignment across the stakeholders in the town, but also it had the other sole purpose to help transform the identity of the town on a town level, but also to work on the social psychology of the town to create a sense of community back into the town for something that was quite industrial up until that point. How do you bring elements of human connection and reconnection back to that? And then the other company that we created is Umdies, which is Economic Development Vehicle. And its purpose was solely to actually bring about the economic development. In part, the blueprint that was created at the inception of the company that Salience led.
Yes.
But also through the process of transformation come about and identify new and others that we perhaps had not yet identified in the past, to constantly look for these ways to bring new economic development opportunities to the town of Oranjemund. With those examples, the point that I think is perhaps more interesting for us to draw from today is there is this trend in the world now to create these vehicles, these special purpose vehicles or public benefit vehicles that could have a different composition, but is ideally created to combine the private sector, public sector and civil society to actually, alongside the normal structures of public government, governance or private sector, is to actually allow this structured method to actually address the development through a vehicle that's got the specific mandate to do it. So the point I'm trying to convey is that I foretell that in city and or town and or regional transformations, you'll see that these public benefit vehicles act in the interest of the public interest, but looks more like a private sector vehicle and draws from the principles of private sector that is good to, on first principles of economic development, leverage that into these vehicles. So I foretell that we will see a lot more of these go into existence worldwide.
That is very interesting, and it's also quite a mouthful. I think I follow what you tried to explain there. Is there a practical example that you can give?
I think, yes. I mean, let's draw on the case of Singapore. So Singapore, as we previously mentioned, separated itself from Malaysia. Yes. Therefore, from a geopolitical perspective, had to create a whole different identity and sense of identity on an international platform. The mechanisms through which, the kind of, let's call it the appointed president did that, he created a home development agency and an economic development agency. And again, these 2 bodies was mandated to actually structurally execute on his strategy. So a strategy was co-created of how one should transform this place and what ideally we want it to be and where we're going. So the vision was created at the highest level of government, if you like. Yeah. But then almost enabled these vehicles to lead the implementation and drive it single-mindedly. So it was almost created a companies that has a sole purpose of achieving the transformation goals. And therefore it's operated on principles of accountability for delivery, on funding cycles. It gives it a lot more teeth and a lot more rigor and a lot more discipline that could be held to account to make sure the progress and intended progress is achieved. There are multitudes of these examples that I can give, but I think that one illustrates the vehicle that we need.
That's perfect. That's a perfect illustration of how these drivers work.
Yes, and how critical they are structurally to help these transformation progress, especially if it's on regional levels or grand scales.
And especially on something like becoming independent, it leaves a lot of room for, I would say, corruption.
Correct.
And
That could be part of it.
from the start to actually have the accountability, have these things.
Correct. So the downside of it is anti-corruption, of course.
Yes.
But the upside is also much greater rigor,
Yes.
much greater discipline and
Yes.
sense of purpose and single-mindedness almost to achieve these goals, to get to that objective that's set from the outset. But yes, all of the international cases are either doing that now through special purpose vehicles or through what they call special legislation. So that in that case, they're using a legal framework to basically give a real tone and direction to that project to make sure that it's actually got a very strong governance mechanism. In this case, law is used as opposed to, well, of course, in the case of companies, you're also using law to an extent, but it is represented through a face of a company where it's an act, a gazetted act. It also gives a very different level of certainty and direction and boundaries. So that it can't be diluted over time, especially over these long cycles of implementation.
Because that's also then
what you need to hedge against. Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned that civil society plays their role as well. Can you expand on that a bit, please?
Yes, just for the listeners. So perhaps, as I'm going to say, there's obviously lots of stakeholders involved in the process of a town transformation, but the three giants on the table is really your public sector, which your local authority or your regional authority, depending on which level of transformation you're working at, and then there's the private sector that we've now discussed. But what is quite often overlooked is civil society. And if I say civil society, I actually mean the citizens, the residents, the community. It doesn't exclude NGOs or public benefit organizations as part of that mix, but I'm really talking here about civil society. And I think we've perhaps in recent years developed to a state where social conditioning has led to civil society quite often blaming government or putting a lot of responsibility on government. It's the government that should, or it's the corporates or the great evil forces of the universe, and extreme capitalism has led us to where we are today. And I'm not saying there's occasionally some merit in some of those persuasions. Of course there is. But the thing that is then overlooked in those discussions is to what extent civil society or communities are not or should take at their level of ability to influence, responsibility to form part of the transformation process. So if I lobby for government to do certain things, to what extent am I as an individual or resident open to changing my behavior, able to put skin in the game to bring about that transformation? Am I going to comply with recycling processes? Am I going to be mindful of my water usage? To what extent am I as a citizen playing an active role in aiding that process of transformation? Because quite often what you see is that civil society almost divorce themselves from that responsibility and put it across to perhaps, as our Russian dolls explained, where you kind of rely on the public sector or your institutions and actually kind of then forego their accountability and or sense of responsibility. And of course, I'm not saying that they can play the role of the public sector, and you perhaps don't have the positional power to make the big decisions.
Yes.
But on day-to-day level, we can do a lot to actually be compliant.
Because it's a grassroots level, starting from the bottom.
Correct. And that kind of whole notion of a transformation really comes if it's all levels of society that plays an active role in actually bringing that about. Otherwise, it makes it a very difficult process if you just do it from the top down. But bottom-up transformations need to come about with also how people see the active role, their sense of purpose, their sense of identity, their willingness to take responsibility for their own future and actively shape that. Obviously in an organized way, in a realistic way, but there's a lot more that civil society can do to aid transformation processes for sure.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying is transformation, progress is mass adoption of the same mindset.
I love that. Exactly. I love that phrase. Yes, I'm going to use that going forward. Is mass adoption of the same.
I have no copyright.
And change mindsets and to let go of the past, right? There's also this notion of shifting mindsets that we've focused on quite a lot in our previous discussion, is being open to shifting identity, shifting expectations, but in that process play an active role.
I think it's a lot. I've seen it change quite a bit here, if I may use a local example, that there is the notion to hold on to certain things, and which is, of course, not saying it's people shouldn't do that. You can't quantify pain or what people went through and so on. But on the other side, I've seen the beautiful aspect of letting go and moving forward.
Correct. And as we previously discussed, that letting go doesn't make anything of the past right, or doesn't make it easy, or, doesn't necessarily say that one throws away traditions, or, just through that process, at some point one needs to actually kind of co-join efforts to find a collective, create a future for all parts of that society, and to make that, and this is very important for me in my process, is much more inclusive in that process. So how do we kind of begin to spend our energy on that spaces? And then through that, it actually leads to a lot more enablement than the perhaps rhetoric of, the past was this and I'm owed this. And that's worldwide the case. I mean, I think we saw similar cases in Stockton, America, or Detroit, America, where there was a lot of, again, expectation that the government needs to turn around, perhaps ills of the past, but, that actually through civil society's competition, you get to much better outcomes if they begin to actively form part and let go of painful situations, where social inequality was a big issue. So I'm not saying that those are not painful components, but how do you actually allow yourself to be open-minded to new identities? And that's where civil society plays a critical role.
I think also the bigger thing here is, from just talking to you, apart from town transformation or country transformation, is actually humanity as a whole transformation, because we are in a different era.
I love that, absolutely.
And there is, it's such an old saying, but the accessibility to information, but not just information, the accessibility to examples of real change,
right,
which can impact people individually or in groups. And that's why I think it's a very interesting time.
It's a very interesting time. And I also do think that the broadest notion of sustainability, I know that it's such an overused term, and I do my best sometimes to avoid that language, but still the principles of existential threat from an environmental perspective, the understanding if you don't solve for more social integration and inclusion, so not necessarily restitution and equality, I'm talking about inclusion, it's a slight different emphasis. I think we're beginning to understand if we don't solve for that in the long term, we're actually going to be in much harder or challenging situations. So we kind of almost have this impetus now where that consciousness is awakened to that opportunity.
Yes.
I think we're seeing the mindsets beginning to shift, and at least from where I stand, I'm beginning to see it shift faster and faster.
Definitely.
So I'm definitely hopeful.
Let's get to the money aspect. Who actually, I think you mentioned this it's a marriage of private and public sector, but who actually funds this transformation?
Here again, like everything else we've discussed, the answer to that question very much hinges around what was the impetus for the transformation, what was the real reason for it. So, for example, if it was an environmental disaster, yes, there's some national funding that can be direct, but more often than not, a huge amount of aid and international aid gets directed to that sense of place. So in that case, funding would be more from an international perspective and foreign aid more than anything else. If it comes and the impetus has been more driven from a geopolitical perspective, then of course quite often you'd find that the government self-funds it because it's got a political ambition or it's got an economic ambition. Where there's situations where perhaps the impetus is driven by a private sector risk or private sector interest or private sector liability, you very quickly see that the funding begins to shift towards there being some responsibility on the private sector to contribute to these funding components. And in that category where there's economic development opportunity, you also very quickly find that depending on what it is that drives that, there could be international interest either in that product more often than not, and therefore they will bring about funding that allows them to have, like we've discussed before, certainty or some interest in securing the delivery of that outcome. And therefore you see again a lot of international funding being offered. Those are the ones that I'm a little bit reticent. Well, do we really understand what is the underlying motivation of that funding and what are the conditions to it, so that the transformation owners actually has still the autonomy that they seek?
Yes.
But yes, so funding can come internationally for sure. Then otherwise, obviously, quite often from the public sector. And of course, the public sector implies that it's taxpayers' money.
Yes.
So let's all be very clear that in a way is civil society's funding. But of course, they've elected people that are directing that funding in their interest, ideally in the long term. And then you've got these notions and few instances where it becomes either purely private sector or certainly some responsibility is shared with the private sector to fund it.
I think also this is then where you come in with your specific skill sets.
Yes.
How do you apply those skill sets? How do you use, what role do you play then in all of this?
I think from my perspective, what will be immensely helpful in these processes, and again, depending on which jurisdictions you are applying your skill, but I think the first skill set I would say is quite critical, is to have some kind of solid legal understanding. In my case, I did qualify as a lawyer first, so I might have a bias for that. So I'm not saying you have to absolutely have a legal qualification, but to have a really solid understanding of governance and governance structures, because a lot of this relies on that. So that kind of notion of some legal risk, and that in that is embedded notions of commercial risk, economic risk, all of that, I think, is a very strong skill set to have that is helpful in that instances. I would also expect that people that operate in this space will definitely have economic development skills, because of course that is the vital linchpin on which, or the catalyst that unlocks the entire enablement of the transformation ultimately. So having economic development skills. I think the other skill set that might not be so obvious is the ability to be able to make decisions or advise on decisions despite complexity. Because if we kind of understand that here it's about decent paced decision-making that unlocks this transformation, the skill set would be is to advise on the people that have positional power, what options they have and which are the best decisions to make despite not all the information yet being on the table, because we're talking about a dynamic environment. So decision-making skills in complexity is, I think, absolute yes. And the fourth, on the technical side, more obvious skill set would be is to have very solid, what I call project or program management skills. So you have to have the discipline to say, we had these goals, are we achieving it? Who's doing it? Who's doing what when? Where do we need to focus on next? And to have that on a very solid project principles. It doesn't, needs to kind of be very solid, because there's so many moving pieces, and who knows in any given moment what moves when. So if you, those I would say is on the more technical side of the persuasion. Of course, you will in-source or partners with all sorts of other technical skills that I don't have in detail, like town planners, urban planners, industry specialists. So that's, maybe something that I should just qualify and not assume. Then the last part or skill set that I think would be the final part that you and I focus on quite a lot is what I would call social psychology or social re-engineering skills.
I was about to.
And I think that is really vital, because there's a lot of stakeholders that you need to work with, that you need to understand, and you truly need to understand their position and need to find common ground across all of these decision makers, but not just that, awaken them to different choices that is available to them. And how do you use those mechanisms to actually unlock their own potential so they can make the best decisions with as much full vision as they can, not just from a technical perspective, but from their own biases and their own identity and perhaps habits or norms, to be able to transcend that, to make very different decisions for the future. So I think I obviously have a bias to that latter aspect for sure.
It's definitely a position that requires, as you mentioned now, a variety of set skills and qualifications, because this is also not something that's going to impact a single person or something for the short term. It's a massive undertaking. And I think out of all those elements, I think the psychology aspect is also very important, especially to the individual, because I think we talked about that earlier, about the whole empathy thing.
Absolutely.
You kind of need to protect yourself also, to avoid imposing what you think should happen.
Absolutely.
And to ensure that these people have the right knowledge, drivers, everything in place.
And to trust that they will choose what is right for them in that given moment. That might not always align with what I might have chosen, but of course I come from a very different context. But yes, I think that social psychology and or social behavioral studies play a fundamental role, and to have a very good command of that.
Yes. I can also imagine that the ability to or the skill set to influence and encourage someone to make a decision is also, it's a huge thing to have, but it also something that weighs a lot on a person as well, because it's ultimately your encouraging.
It's big decisions being made, right?
Yeah.
And it's big decisions on money and or prioritization basis, but you kind of also have this fantastic opportunity to shape a future.
Yes.
And that is daunting, but also awe-inspiring. So one has to be very mindful that you are doing it with as much objectivity and with as much certainty as you can, but not to a point that you slow down the process and stifle the process. And I think that's where people like us, differentiate, and hopefully salients uniquely differentiate, that we are prepared on incomplete information, but sufficient information that one really has a good command that this is definitely the safest, or at least here are 2-3 choices, and these are the pros and cons to those choices. Where do you want to play? Because that obviously influences the cascading decisions that may stem from that, and then ultimately opens up your trajectory of how far you can transform or not.
How do you measure the success of town transformation? How do you actually measure that?
That's not really easy,
No.
I have to admit. And how we go about it is very much like good project management disciplines right at the outset. Even if it's in very clear increments, set out very clear goals that you want to achieve by a particular point in time. And from my perspective, at least, I go about setting what I would call quantifiable goals. So that will be very much your technical goals. Have we increased so many houses? Are we replacing or creating economic measured through levels of GDP or job opportunities? Are more people employed? Have we created the security or the potential that we have? Is the town growing? Can we accommodate so many more citizens? But then there's also the qualitative norms. Are we increasing the skill set? Are we shifting identities? And those are much harder to measure. And a lot of subjectivity or indirect measures there apply. So from my perspective, it's difficult sometimes on the qualitative side to express your success. But the way that I'm going to say is alongside those more disciplined measures of ensuring your success is to also kind of make sure are you able to look back and say the place is better, there's more generally economic access, there's more sense of belonging. And can you, alongside objective measures, also subjectively look at it and say, yes, this is definitely beginning to reach a place where artificial intervention is no longer necessary. There's more ability to organically actually go to a normalized state where the normal leaders can take over and fulfill their roles sustainably. So that notion is, can they actually begin to lead their place again in an ordinary course of business way? And then you've reached states of success. But it's a dynamic process.
Yeah.
I don't think you ever quite get to that sense of perfection. But if you're very strongly in that direction, I think you've achieved success.
Can you give an example, either something you have worked on or something that inspired you, which you can say is a successful story?
I think I will pick a mining town case, and I will pick a Canadian case. I think we might have referred to that before. And the case is, the name of the mining town is Elliott Lake. It is actually in Elliott Lake, Ontario, Canada. And in this case, it was an uranium mining town, or actually a group of towns that was created around this industry. And then the Canadian government was the off-taker of this product. It bought a lot of uranium from these mines. And then the government cancelled the contracts because it could actually buy the uranium cheaper from elsewhere. Okay. And as a consequence of that, the entire series of towns were at risk of collapse. In fact, did collapse. And through that case, over a period of time, the government actually did two things that I think was extremely forward-thinking. One, of course, it provided funding to compensate for that. So it put actually a tremendous amount of money from the outset into a special purpose vehicle. So the success was they created a vehicle and understood that it nor the mine would be ideal to lead this transformation. So they did right by actually securing funding. But more importantly, actually, and this is to my notion of enablement rather than money, it availed assets. So some of the assets that was in and around these towns, it actually gave into this SPV to say, well, you take these assets, you take these properties, you take these lakes, you take these bridges, and you figure out how do you kind of achieve economic development from this. And then this SPV then went about to actually in this very small town that would have entirely collapsed, created a tourism attractions, created a retirement village, and actually created substance abuse rehabilitation centers that actually kind of gave this town a very clear reason to exist. And therefore the private sector and public sector with civil society worked well together to achieve outcomes that secured jobs, that secured a future, and secured and reestablished a sense of place.
Thank you. That's a fantastic example. And it's good to know that things like that are possible.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That there isn't necessarily, it's a hopeless situation.
Of course not. Yes.
It's the enablement.
Correct.
That you've been mentioning so often.
Yes, and of course they didn't achieve that success at the get-go, it was a 25-year process,
Yes.
ultimately, in this case, where there are lots of failures beginning. But again, we can leverage from these learnings. And yes, we might make our own mistakes, but hopefully we won't repeat mistakes
Yes.
from our past or the past of others that we can learn from. And maybe I should actually add that something is to be able to learn from one's mistakes might be a skill set that
think
comes in
that's
super handy.
Learn from your own and from others.
And from others'
Yes.
mistake, and be wise enough to know the difference. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Rita. I think you gave us some very good insight into the key players in radical transformation, town transformation, country transformation, and very insightful things. And again, please have a look at the other episodes if you want to get more information about radical town transformation and a few examples and so on. And this is not the last conversation. We will be back in a few future episodes talking about other aspects of the transformation process.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Thank you for having me.